Dr. Michael Egnor is a professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook University and author of The Immortal Mind. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jekielek.
We're not the first people to ask this question, to delve into this. There was a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist named Wilder Penfield back in the early 20th century, who was really the greatest neuroscientist in the neurosurgical profession. And he began his career as a materialist. He believed that everything came from the brain. But he asked this question earlier in his career. He asked, does the brain explain the mind completely? And he sought the answer to that question through 40 years of clinical experience and research. And at the end of his career, he wrote a book called Mystery of the Mind. And he said the answer to that question is no, the brain does not explain the mind completely. There's an aspect of the mind that is not from the brain. One of the reasons that we have that problem is René Descartes. Descartes was a philosopher back in the 17th century who changed the way we look at living things and at reality in general. And he believed that living things were machines of sorts. They were meat machines, biological machines. And that in human beings, the soul was like a ghost that kind of inhered inside the machine. And that it became the basis for philosopher Gilbert Ryle's comment that we're sort of like a ghost in a machine. But that was not the way that ancient philosophers looked at human beings. They didn't look at us as machines inhabited by ghosts. They looked at us as integrated living things. Whether we know specifically what Descartes said, we've all inherited his way of looking at us as if we're meat machines of some sort. And if you assume that you're a meat machine, then of course it's difficult to distinguish mind from machine. And then you say, well, how can a machine give rise to a mind? And the fact is that a machine can't give rise to a mind, because a machine is defined as something that doesn't have a mind. It's just a mechanical arrangement of parts. So this confusion, the ancients never had a mind-brain problem. That never bothered them at all. They had no problem with that at all. They understood us as having souls. And souls are an integration of our physical abilities and our spiritual abilities. They're all integrated. So the ancients didn't have this mind-brain problem. That's a modern problem that comes from Descartes.
From a scientific perspective, can you see that distinction?
Yes, you can. It is not widely acknowledged in neuroscience because neuroscience works through a materialist bias, and neuroscientists who sort of stand up and say we have souls are few and far between. It can threaten one's career if one says things like that too much. But when you look carefully at the neuroscience, the best neuroscience over the past century, it clearly points to the existence of a soul and to the existence of aspects of our mind that don't come from the brain. The brain is an organ, just like the heart, the lungs, the kidney, things like that. It does organ things. The organ things it does is that it makes action potentials, electrical impulses in nerves. It makes neurotransmitters, chemicals that affect our mood and so on. What we call the mind nowadays is simply various powers of the soul. The soul is all the things in us that make us alive. It's not a ghosty thing. It's not like this translucent thing that you can look through. The soul is just what makes us living human beings. Our heartbeat, our breathing, our metabolism, our thinking, our talking, all that stuff. And our soul gives us various powers, various abilities to do things. It gives us an ability to move and to have memories and to have sensations and to have emotions. It also gives us a power to use reason and free will. The brain specifically causes our movements, our memories, our emotions, our perceptions. They come from the brain. That's organ things the brain does. But the brain doesn't cause reason and free will. The brain allows us to express our reason and express our free will by talking, by writing, by things like that. But reason and free will are not material powers of the soul. So they're powers of us, but they're not powers of the brain.
How can you tell?
There are several ways of figuring out whether an organ does something. One way is to stimulate the organ and get it to do it, so you can prove it does it. The other way is to inhibit the organ from doing it and prove that when the organ's inhibited, it doesn't happen. Well, that can happen with the brain. While it is true that if you suppress the brain, we can't use reason and free will very well. If you get hit on the head with a baseball bat, your reasoning and your free will is going to be a little messed up for a while. Another way is to, for a doctor, to actually stimulate the brain directly, kind of like a seizure would do, only in a controlled circumstance. And that has been done many times. We stimulate the surface of the brain with an electrical probe, and we ask the patient what's happening. Are they thinking of things as we stimulate the brain? Does it make a muscle move? Does it make them have tingling? Things like that. When you do that, you can elicit from the brain, by stimulating it, movement, perception, memory, and emotion. But you can never elicit reason or free will. No matter where you stimulate the brain, you can't make a person say 1 + 1 is 2, or say if A then B, A therefore B, modus ponens, or say I believe that it's nice to be kind, which is a moral viewpoint. So it's perfectly reasonable to infer that reason and free will don't naturally come from the brain, because you can't make the brain do it. All my textbooks in medical school describe the brain as like a computer. It's like the hardware, and the mind was like the software, and that's how things worked. And we have detailed neuroanatomical studies of the structure of the frontal lobes and all these things. And but I had patients who were missing major parts of their brains, who were perfectly normal people. It's as if you have a laptop and it works perfectly, and then you open it up and you find out that your hard drive is like 2/3 missing. So then how does my laptop work? It's a perplexing question. And so I began looking more deeply into the neuroscience of the mind-brain relationship. And I came across this rather astonishing but quite verifiable result that reason and free will don't seem to come from the brain. And interestingly enough, that's what the classical philosophers thought. That was what Aristotle said 2,300 years ago. First of all, I don't by any means mean to imply that if you're missing a lot of your brain, you'll definitely do okay. Meaning there are lots of people who are very impaired because of brain damage and things like that. But there are lots of people who are very impaired whose brains structurally look pretty good, actually. So the correlation is kind of loose. And there are many, many people who have missing parts of the brain, who are really highly functioning people. So neuroscience is just fundamentally wrong in a lot of ways. And I think it's because of the materialist bias in neuroscience. We can't get away from this machine analogy. And we're not machines. And we don't work like machines work. There's overwhelming evidence in neuroscience for the existence of a soul. And I think we really need to rethink how our minds work and how our souls work and how it relates to us as human beings. It's important to recognize up front that while reason and free will don't come from the brain, that many things do come from the brain. And you could say that there are 6 things that definitely come from the brain, no question about it. The first is what's called homeostasis, which just means all your physiological regulation, control of your heart rate, your breathing. If your brain doesn't work right, you have trouble breathing. So that's real. The second thing that comes from the brain is arousal, meaning that if your brain is working right, you're awake and alert and you pay attention. If your brain isn't working right, you're drowsy or you're comatose and so on. So your brain makes you awake. And then the 4 things that were found in seizures and brain stimulation, that is movement, perception, memory, and emotion. Those all come from the brain. Reason and free will don't. But in everyday life, we tend to integrate them. They tend to happen kind of alongside one another.
You're telling me that motivation doesn't come from free will, I think.
They're related to one another, but they're not the same thing. There are 2 different kinds of appetites. There are what Aristotle called sensitive appetites, and there are rational appetites. Sensitive appetites are like if I see a piece of cake, and I say, man, I'd like to eat that piece of cake. That's a sensitive appetite. I'm hungry, I want to eat the thing. My dog sees a piece of bacon. He has a sensitive appetite. He wants that bacon no matter what. But there's rational appetites. A rational appetite might be, I want to stick to my diet. I don't want to exceed 2,000 calories today, so I'm not going to eat that cake. Now, that's a rational appetite. So human life, in some sense, is a continuous struggle between sensitive appetites and rational appetites. We want things that we shouldn't have, or we don't want things that we should want, that we should have. And it's a struggle.
So in a way, you're saying that's basically the struggle between the mind and the brain.
In that sense, yes.
Fascinating.
In that sense, yes. And that particular phenomenon was described in some detail by Benjamin Libet, who was a neuroscientist in the mid-20th century. Fascinating man. His obsession in science was with what he called mind time. He was very interested in what's happening inside the brain at the moment you have a thought. Like, we do brain waves, and brain waves, you can kind of correlate them in very rough ways to thought. But he wanted to know down to the millisecond, at the moment you have this thought, what's your brain doing? So he did some very ingenious experiments to look at that. And he found in his most famous experiments, and in the neuroscience community, these Libet experiments are very famous, that when you have a desire to do something, there is a brainwave that happens about half a second before you are consciously aware of the desire to do it. Like, let's say that I have a desire to have a piece of cake. If you look really carefully and study brainwaves, at least by Libet's kind of experiments, you find that the brainwave that corresponds to your thought, boy, I'm going to have that cake, happens before you're aware of the thought, by about half a second. So there's this spark, and then you want the cake. And the initial interpretation of that was that we don't have free will, that everything we do is driven by the brain. We're just sort of these robots that get these sparks that we can't control. But Libet was a very clever researcher, a very good scientist. So he, in his experiments, would ask his subjects in the experimental setup to occasionally veto the thought. That is, to think you were going to do something and then say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And what he found was that the veto didn't have a change in brain waves. So he said, the veto doesn't seem to be the brain. So he was a dualist. He was a property dualist. And he said that we have free will. But he said, it's more like it's free won't. He says that what happens is that the term he used is that the brain presents us with a sea of velleities, which I guess means a sea of temptations, constant, like waves, just constantly coming up, and they're pre-conscious. They move us, but we're not completely consciously aware of it. We just feel that we have to do something. And he said, but we retain the free choice to accept it or deny it, and that's where free will comes in, and it's kind of like free won't. Mm-hmm. So his term free won't has become very famous in neuroscience. Immaterial means that the source of these powers is not a physical thing. It's not a physical object. So there are many, many, many things that we think about, many things that are quite real. They're called universals in philosophy that are very real but are not matter. And reason and free will are abilities we have whose source is our soul, but not our brains.
Yeah.
A brain can't think. Mm-hmm. How can a brain think? A brain's a lump of meat. Can't think. Some people say the brain sees. The brain sees this or that, and I say, hey, it's dark inside there and it doesn't have a flashlight. It can't see anything. The brain doesn't think. People think, using their brains. I mean, that's fine. But the brain doesn't think. Mechanical philosophy really became a thing in the 19th century, although it was growing since Descartes. When people started making very sophisticated machines during the Industrial Revolution, we got really good, all these steam engine and the printing press, all that stuff. People began starting to think of human beings as machines, or as nature as a machine. Mm-hmm. And by the 19th century, that was kind of implicit in the way people thought about things.
I think it still is implicit.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How people think.
Mechanical philosophy is everywhere.
Yeah.
And but we aren't machines. Nature is not a machine. You can make analogies. You can say, well, in some ways we're kind of like machines. That's fine. But we're not machines. Yeah, near-death experiences are surprisingly common, actually. It's been estimated that about 20 million Americans now living either have had a near-death experience or will have a near-death experience at some point in their lifetime. Carol Zaleski is a literary scholar who wrote a wonderful book called Otherworld Journeys, in which she recounts near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences throughout history in various cultures. Pam Reynolds was a woman who, in her mid-30s, was found to have an aneurysm at a major blood vessel at the base of her brain. The aneurysm at the time, this was in the 1991, was inoperable through ordinary means, and she would die soon from rupture of the aneurysm. She came to Phoenix, as it turns out, to Dr. Robert Spetzler, who is a neurosurgeon here in Phoenix, who is the world's expert in aneurysms. And he had an operation he called a standstill procedure, which was a very radical procedure for treating certain kinds of aneurysms. And the problem with her aneurysm is that it involved the basilar artery at the base of her brain, which is a critical artery. And the aneurysm was this ballooning, kind of asymmetrical enlargement of the artery that was about to burst. And the artery had to be reconstructed. But the process of reconstructing the artery could not be done while it had blood flowing through it. So there had to be some way to stop the blood flowing through it. But if you stop the blood flowing through it, you die. So what Spetzler worked out was an operation, and he did it a number of times on Reynolds and other patients, and it was quite successful, where he would put them under anesthesia, open their head, expose a region of the aneurysm, cool their body down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, put them on a heart-lung machine, stop their heart, raise the head of the bed, drain the blood out of their brain, and he had about 30 minutes to rebuild the artery. So we could open the artery, the person was as dead as it gets, and he could then rebuild the artery, and then once the artery was rebuilt, he would then restart their heart, then put them back in a heart-lung machine, restart their heart, warm their body back up, close the operation. And so we did this with her. During the process, she was heavily monitored, meaning that they had to make sure that her brain was dead, because that actually protected her brain. When it was cooled down and everything was stopped, which gave him more time to operate. And after her surgery, and she made an excellent recovery, the aneurysm was fixed, she said, I watched the whole surgery. So he said, you couldn't have watched the whole surgery. You were brain dead, you were under surgical drapes. No. So she then told him all about the surgery, the details she saw. She said that what happened was, when her heart stopped, she was a musician. She said she heard a natural D, was the way she described it. It was like a hum. And then all of a sudden she felt that she popped out of her body. And she could see her body, and she could see the room. And she said she went up to the ceiling, and she could see everyone there. She could see Spetzler, she could see the instrument, she could see herself, all the other people there. And then she hovered over his shoulder and watched him operate on her. And she described his instruments to him in some detail, in things that she could not have known unless she was a surgeon in the operating room. That is, there were details of the structure of the instruments. He had custom-made instruments. And she described conversations that he had, word by word, that he was talking about. She described issues that arose during the surgery and conversations between doctors. She described the music they were playing in the operating room while she was brain dead. She said that while she was watching, she then saw a tunnel, and she felt herself being pulled down the tunnel. So it was this very pleasant feeling. It wasn't like she was being dragged. And at the other end of the tunnel, she saw this beautiful world, and she saw, I think it was her grandparents who had passed away. And her grandparents told her that it wasn't her time yet, and that she had children to raise, and she had to go back. So she went back down the tunnel, and she went back into her body, and when her heart restarted. And she said it was like diving into ice water. She said it was extremely unpleasant, which, yeah, it was 60 degrees. It was very cold, actually. Her near-death experience is undoubtedly the best documented near-death experience in medical history, because it was almost an experiment. It was almost like a prospective study where they actually did it on purpose. Usually when people have near-death experiences, it's chaos. You know, they're in a hospital, their heart stops, people are desperately trying to resuscitate them. For her, it was all very carefully planned. For people who deny the reality of near-death experiences, usually materialists who say it's just brain chemistry, it's, you know, some hallucination or something, I have what I call the Pam Reynolds challenge, meaning that it may be that some near-death experiences are hallucinatory experiences or seizures or some kind of thing, but there are 4 characteristics of many near-death experiences that have to be explained. And the first characteristic is that the experiences are very often very clear, very coherent, very detailed. People often have a detailed life review during it. And brain death doesn't make you better. It doesn't make you clear and coherent. I mean, I've seen thousands of people who had serious brain problems. It doesn't make you think more clearly. But near-death experiences are remarkably clear. The second characteristic of near-death experiences that warrant an explanation is the out-of-body experience. That there are at least hundreds, if not thousands of people reported in the medical literature who observe things during a near-death experience that they could not have observed in the body. You know, they're on a table, people are pumping away on their chest, and they'll see name tags of people on the other side of the room. There are people in near-death experiences who see things in distant cities that can be confirmed. There's a lot of that. So there are out-of-body experiences that are called veridical, meaning that they correspond to confirmed testing. The third characteristic of near-death experiences, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is that as far as I know, in all of the literature of near-death experiences in the scientific literature, there's never been a report of somebody who's gone down the proverbial tunnel and seen a living person at the other end of the tunnel. The people you encounter on the other side are always dead people. And if these were hallucinations or wishful thinking,
at least once in a while you would
once in a while you'd run into your husband or wife who's still living, just for, you know, because it's not, you're looking for someone to comfort you. And there are well over a dozen reports in the medical literature of people encountering dead people on the other side of the tunnel that they didn't know were dead. Either they had died like a couple days before the near-death experience and they hadn't been told of their relative's death. There are situations, several, of people in car accidents where multiple people were injured in the car accident and they're sent to different hospitals. And one person will have a near-death experience at a hospital and see another person who was in the car who died at another hospital, and they had no way of knowing that they had died, but they don't see the people who lived. And the fourth characteristic of near-death experiences is that they are often transformative. People are different people afterwards. They lose their fear of death. They're very different people.
Yeah, and I guess you would say that that is the mind.
That's the soul.
That's the soul. That's different.
Well, the soul is the aggregate. The soul is sort of you. It's kind of everything put together. The mind is several powers of.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood, because the brain obviously is not present at this point. The brain is part of that aggregate.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. A very interesting question, and I think it's a very perceptive question that's been asked, and that is, how do you see things without eyes? Your eyes are dead too when it happens. And then how do you see? Or how do you remember? You know, memory does seem to be a brain function. Well, how do you remember what happened in the near-death experience if your brain is not working? And the answer to that is, I think, is when you ask people about their experiences with near-death experiences, virtually all near-death experiencers say, I'm going to tell you what happened, but what I'm telling you is not really what happened. That is, it's ineffable. What happened is something I can't give you words for, but this is the best I can do with language. And then they tell you in the words they can choose. So I think that when they say they can see, first of all, they don't describe it as mortal vision. They say it's amazingly clear. The colors are unbelievably beautiful. And there's a fascinating comment by Thomas Aquinas, a great medieval scholastic theologian, that because similar questions were asked by the medievals, you know, after death, when you are in heaven or in hell, when you're anywhere, how can you see? You know, especially if the Christian says you don't have your resurrection body yet. How do you see without eyes? And Thomas Aquinas said that we perceive after death by divine light. That there are ways of seeing that don't involve eyes. Mm-hmm. So I think, personally, I think that's what near-death experiencers are seeing and remembering, is by virtue of powers that transcend ordinary mortal powers. My goal in all of this, in writing The Immortal Mind with my colleague, science journalist Denise O'Leary, my goal in all of this is to let people know, people who are believers in God and people who aren't believers in God, or people who are questioning, that the existence of the human soul is completely consistent with the best modern neuroscience. That science is not our enemy. And that if we look at science objectively and if we look at the real evidence, we have souls. And there are immaterial powers of our soul, reason and free will, and that our souls are immortal.
Well, Michael Egnor, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to be here.